Leading up to World War II, the United States had recently been in a costly world war. There had been economic depression, and there were acts of genocide across the world. When the war began, all able-bodied men were off fighting in the war. The sacrifices, not just by the men fighting in the war, but by American citizens back at home, were tremendous. Women were taking on blue-collar jobs, such as working in factories, while raising their children. The country was increasingly depleted, and the government needed a way to keep up the sense of patriotism and morale in the country. Who did they turn to? During World War II, in order to gain support for the war, the government distributed propaganda films, including cartoons, because they needed a means for educating the population in a way that was accessible and comprehensible for the people. This led to the American population's willingness to intervene to fight in the war. In order to understand our thesis, we must define propaganda. Propaganda is the spreading of information, either true or false, or an idea in order to influence the opinion of society. It is a technique for promoting a viewpoint or a political cause. In Warner Brothers films, Popeye and Bugs Bunny are sent to fight against the Japanese. Walt Disney released a cartoon portraying Donald Duck as a Nazi, getting treated miserably while working for Hitler. One of the most important war propaganda films is Why We Fight. The Office of War Information released Why We Fight, a series of 7 documentaries explaining the origins of the global conflict and the risk of passivity.
Generally speaking, what happens during the war is that the Office of War Information sets up a bureau in Hollywood in 1942, and their goal is to inject various propaganda messages into the movies.
One of the films, Prelude to War, even won an Academy Award for Best Documentary. In fact, the movies were considered so vital to the American war effort, the U.S. Army awarded the director, Frank Capra, the Distinguished Service Medal. Susan Elizabeth Dalton says that,
during World War II, cartoons went into a new dimension with the addition of extreme violence, but this violence was very popular. Sure, the public liked watching Daffy Duck hit Elmer Fudd, but watching Daffy give it to Hitler was hilarious.
Bob Clampett, a top animator, told Funny World in an interview that Bugs Bunny has never been as loved as he was during the time of World War II. This is because Bugs, similar to Donald Duck, was a symbol of America's resistance to Hitler and other fascist powers. America was fighting in one of the most significant wars ever, and even now, it's hard to comprehend the emotional impact that Bugs Bunny exerted on his audience.
Propaganda, mainly for the home front. For example, as you mentioned, Walt Disney, which is showed in every movie house in the country every week, glorified and emphasized America's role in the fighting in the war.
This type of propaganda was played in theaters. Sometimes these films would be shown before a movie, and they would be labeled as short films. These short films were very popular and would even win awards, such as Defer's Face, which won the 1943 Oscar for Best Animated Short Film. In 1943, people were very easily influenced by these films. A study showed that out of 26 million Americans, more than a third of them later admitted they'd been saving their taxes in part thanks to Donald Duck. These movies were very easy to understand, which was helpful for a mostly uneducated population. Very few American citizens were reading newspapers, and there were no televisions, limiting their access to government-disseminated information. In 1940, only 5% of the population completed 4 years of college. Newspapers were accessible to the educated population, but clearly the population of educated people was the minority. The font size on newspapers was very small. Newspapers used relatively big words, and the writing was very dense, making it even more difficult for the average American to gain information from the newspapers. Information needed to get to the masses, and movies were a useful source. With films, the general population can obtain information easily while being entertained. Americans were able to relate to the anti-Nazi sentiment through the influence of the movies. Americans loved Donald Duck, and he was a household name. So, when the Nazis mistreated Donald Duck in a film, the Americans hated the Nazis.
I think any time that films can show a connection, either in the way that we're thinking in terms of ideology, in terms of shared interests, it's a lot easier to say, yes, that's why I'm fighting.
The cost to see a movie was approximately 25 cents, which is equal to $7 in today's money, making it affordable for the average American. Because of this, 85 million Americans, 65% of the population, went to the theaters each week. Additionally, without television, there was minimal competition in terms of entertainment, and films in color were a relatively recent idea, so people were very excited to go to the movies.
Probably the films during the war were the most important because, this is really Hollywood's golden age. The movies were then what television is today, so it was overwhelmingly influential.
Prior to World War II, the U.S. population was split between involvement and isolation. The isolationists believed in peace and thought the U.S. should try to stay out of global conflicts. The government needed the population to be pro-involvement because they played a crucial role in the war. They physically fought in the war, they financed the war, and they produced the equipment for the war.
There was not a town in America, large or small, that did not have its big scrap drives. Americans rummaged through their attics and basements for aluminum, brass, copper, tin, anything that could be melted down and used to make guns or tanks or planes.
At the height of the war, the militaries of the Axis powers combined to have roughly 20 million men. Before their involvement in the war, the U.S. had roughly 500,000 men. Knowing that an army as small as 500,000 men wouldn't stand a chance in the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, putting in place a peacetime draft for the first time in the country's history. This helped the U.S. bolster their weak military to 1.8 million men in just a year, and over 12 million men by 1945. Although some people were forced to join the army, they would have approached their duty apathetically. This would have made it much more difficult for the U.S. to win battles. Therefore, the positive attitude of the population created by these films played an important role in the fight. Leading up to the war, the U.S. economy struggled greatly. In order to finance their involvement in the war, the U.S. needed to produce money, so they turned to the people through propaganda. Through a strong propaganda film campaign, the average American citizen would buy war bonds. Not only did this help America's economy, but it also helped fund the war and boost the morale of the population by letting the common American buy into the message that America should intervene in the war. During World War II, the American household altered greatly, leading to a change in workforce and sacrifice on the part of all citizens. The government needed to reach out to all people to convince them to join the cause. Pre-World War II, many people across the country worked in factories. However, during the war, this all changed. Almost all factories converted to making war supplies. Many of the male factory workers were off fighting in the war, so women and children were forced to work in factories. Another reason the average home changed was food rationing. On January 30th, 1942, the Office of Price Administration gained the power to ration food among the country. Every citizen was given a book full of stamps to be turned in when buying certain foods. By March of 1943, a voucher issued by the government was necessary to purchase sugar, coffee, meat, cheese, fats, canned fish, and canned milk. Therefore, the population was crucial to producing supplies during the war. While Pearl Harbor may have influenced the United States to enter the war, the ongoing propaganda campaign by the U.S. government kept morale up throughout the war. Film propaganda was not the only type of propaganda released. There were also radio shows, songs, posters, and newspapers.
Films were perhaps the most effective form of propaganda because they were very easy for the average person to understand.
This use of film propaganda showed the power of the media. Without the propaganda, perhaps the U.S. would have not won the war. Thankfully, the U.S. government took a stand against fascist powers by educating the people of America in a comprehensible and accessible way.